This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Hannah Tyler. In this week's special Thanksgiving episode, we continue our tradition from the last few years of looking at this most American of holidays from the perspectives of new Americans. First, BPC Managing Director of Immigration Theresa Cardinal Brown is joined by Anya McMurray, President and COO of Welcome.us, to talk about how America has welcomed diverse immigrants over the last 2 years, from Afghans to Ukrainians to Venezuelans, to the people of New York City and Martha's Vineyard who welcomed migrants bussed there from the border. Then, I'll have a conversation with Lucija Bebek, BPC's spring immigration intern, who shares her own immigrant Thanksgiving story. A great episode to come, so stick around.
We're back, and I'm joined by Anya McMurray, who is President and COO of Welcome.us. Welcome.us was formed less than 2 years ago to coordinate support of Afghan refugees in the U.S. in the wake of the evacuation of Afghanistan in that year. Since then, Welcome.us has worked to create, institutionalize, and coordinate welcome among diverse groups of Americans who are willing to share their time and resources to help the newest additions to America. They have been supporting the parole programs for Ukrainians and the recently announced parole program for Venezuelans. Before joining Welcome.us, Anya was the Senior Director of Strategy and Policy for Immigration at the Emerson Collective. And before that, she served on the Hill as Deputy General Counsel to Senator Patrick Leahy. So welcome, Anya, to This Week in Immigration.
Thanks. It's so nice to be here with you.
So I said a little bit about Welcome.us, but do you want to talk a little bit more about the organization, your mission, and how it has grown and changed in the last 2 years?
Sure. So we launched Welcome.us in the immediate aftermath of the fall of Kabul to help galvanize what we saw as a whole of country effort to welcome and support our new Afghan neighbors. We started Welcome not because we thought Americans would need convincing. It really was in response to this overwhelming hand-raising that we saw unfolding around us, from the corporate sector to civic organizations to faith-based organizations to my neighborhood listserv, and I'm sure you saw this on your neighborhood listserv. I mean, it was really everywhere, and it also wasn't contained to particular parts of the country. We saw hands going up all over the country in small communities and in major cities. And we wanted to help galvanize that energy and direct it to having an impact on this huge number of people who really needed a helping hand. And we did that by making it easier for folks to donate money, donate goods, volunteer, and ultimately to sponsor. And all of those opportunities we made available on our website and through relationships with partners around the country.
Yeah, so it was obviously a giant undertaking because that happened all so fast. But it really was this idea of sponsor circles, which started with the Afghan evacuees. And now it seems like the government is taking on to do similar formula for Ukrainians under the Uniting for Ukraine initiative, and more recently with the Venezuelan parole program. So can you talk a little bit about the history of community sponsorship in the United States, and why is now the right moment to kind of bring that idea back?
Yeah, and I think, yes, absolutely. And it's really exciting that you're linking this work in that way, because I think Welcome.us was stood up in response to the Afghan evacuation, but since then, and largely in partnership with the federal government, there have been these opportunities to expand the work and support new populations. And that was always the idea behind Welcome.us, was that it would start with an Afghan response, but then quickly, as people became more able to participate, our theory of the case, and we've absolutely seen this play out in real time, is that once you start this process, you actually care less and less about the who you are helping and more about the way in which you're helping. And you expand that engagement from Afghans to Ukrainians. Now we're seeing it with Venezuelans. And I think you're absolutely right. What we're trying to tap into was something that existed for many decades in the United States, which was community sponsorship. And it was certainly not a panacea. There were also challenges there. We're talking about the movement of people. There will always be challenges. But what did exist before the 1980 Refugee Resettlement Act, which is so important, but was an easier on-ramp for the general public to help support, to bring over through private sponsorship and then help get resettled in communities. Tens of thousands of people from many parts of the country. And what we're doing now, and our friends at the Community Sponsorship Hub started with sponsor circles, was that same concept married to some of the supports that we have in our current refugee resettlement system. They started that opportunity for Afghans. And it has been a real success, and there have been several hundred Afghans who were resettled through that process. I can say actually my parents were a sponsor circle in Iowa, and so I have had a chance to sort of see it up close and how it has worked in the real world, and it has only made me a more fervent believer that there is a tremendous opportunity here. And now what we're seeing with Uniting for Ukraine and the process for Venezuela is different than the sponsor circles, but is that same concept of if you give more room for Americans to raise their hand to help, they will step up, and they have in really astounding numbers. When I think about what we've seen with Ukrainians, over 165,000 Americans have submitted applications to sponsor Ukrainian newcomers. And I did not check the numbers this morning, but I think we are approaching 70,000 Ukrainians who have now been resettled into the United States in 6 months with very little chaos, with a really impressive, I think, example of what we can do when we unleash the capacity of this incredible country to do that work of welcoming.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about the responsibilities the sponsors have. You sort of said that what Welcome.us is trying to kind of marry the federal refugee resettlement program, which is administered by, the 9 major nonprofit refugee resettlement agencies, with this sort of local community idea of sponsorship. So what if somebody does raise their hand and says, I want to sponsor somebody, what are they responsible for doing? What does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it depends a bit on the program, but at the end of the day, sponsors provide day-to-day support to make sure that newcomers are welcomed in their new communities and have the information and tools they need to start their new lives in the U.S. For a fuller understanding and to get into a bit more of the nitty-gritty, I'd recommend folks visit welcome.us, where we lay out with more specificity and have some, I think, really comprehensive, frequently asked questions that can provide more information. But a couple of additional examples are you need to have the financial ability to help support the refugee or the beneficiary, the Ukrainian or Venezuelan. It's not a particular amount of money. You simply need to, in the form that you fill out with USCIS, indicate that you have sufficient assets to help should they be necessary. It's also things like meeting newcomers at the airport, which is a really amazing experience.
Kind of basic, but really important.
Really
right?
important. I have a video of my parents waiting in the small local airport in Iowa for the Afghan family that they've now been supporting along with 8 other families in Iowa. And it's just a really powerful moment when you see this, the feeling of hope and optimism on the faces of newcomers and the excitement on the face of the Americans, and sort of those initial hellos in a foreign language and practicing what becomes in many instances the use of universal sign language as you point to things, and it breaks down a lot of barriers really fast. But it's also things like helping them find a place to live, helping them apply for jobs, helping get their kids enrolled in schools, and it's ultimately really being a friend, being a first friend, being a guide. And I think, again, what I've seen up close in my parents' instance, but certainly in other examples, even here in Northern Virginia and the DC area, is it really changes the life of the welcomer as much as it changes the life of the newcomer. And I think at its core, that is the work that we're trying to do. We believe strongly that Americans are welcomers. They're already doing so much of this work. We want to make it easier for them to do. And in the process, we think we will increase the capacity of America to welcome more from other parts of the world, not just these narrow three. But we also think that we begin to break down the barriers and the polarization that has begun to emerge in the issue of refugee resettlement and welcoming of newcomers. And that's, at the end of the day, we think that is just so critically important to being prepared to respond to the challenges that climate change is certainly going to bring around migration. And we see it as an opportunity to also help rebuild our own communities. People are looking for ways to get involved with each other. They're looking for service opportunities and ways to be back out in the world that make them feel good and like they are contributing. And this brings that opportunity to your doorstep. And you can change a life in the process. It's really a very powerful thing.
Yeah, and you talked a lot about communities and how this brings communities together. So let's talk about those local communities as resettled people are matched to specific cities or communities. Do you get help and support from like local government, mayors, governors, other local officials? Is it nonprofit, private sector? Is it just a neighborhood group gets together and says, "I want to help"? Like how are all these players involved?
Absolutely. This is a incredibly large and diverse country, and what we're seeing is that it looks different in every place. In some places, it is very much a community endeavor, where it is often connected to a faith-based group or a service organization. We've seen Rotary clubs, for example, raise their hand and begin to sponsor. But one of the roles that Welcome is playing is helping to make more visible to the welcomer many of the resources that already exist in your local community to support newcomers. Because as we know, many people have been coming to communities all over the country for many, many years. And there are significant resources available for folks. It does vary on the way in which you got here, which is one of the complexities of our immigration system for sure. But in cities like, not surprisingly, New York and Chicago and LA, there are programs, the city is rolling up their sleeves and getting very involved. In other communities, it is more left to the individual. Certainly some states are getting increasingly involved, and they're not always the states that you would expect. The governor of Indiana recently lifted up and congratulated organizations that were supporting Ukrainians in their arrival. I think we're seeing kind of an increasing awareness of both the resources that are available for newcomers, regardless of your status, but also an increasing awareness of how difficult it can be for newcomers to actually find your way through our very Byzantine bureaucratic systems. And candidly, that's as true for refugees coming through the State Department sort of formal refugee channel. After their 90 days, where they get a lot of hands-on support from the resettlement agencies, which is so important, they really find their way through engagement with through the programs that states and cities are providing. Many of those programs are not specific to refugees, but are much more generalized in their support for newcomers. And again, a lot of what Welcome is doing is help translate what's out there and make it more easily findable for the American welcomers who are helping the newcomer along the path to integration.
Yeah, it seems to me that, again, since 1980 and the Refugee Act, the federal government has sort of taken on that overall coordination, sponsorship role. Yes, we have the 9 resettlement agencies, but we kind of lost that local personal connection. Oh, there's another organization that's handling that. I don't need to get involved. And, it's strange to me. Maybe it's not strange, but it's interesting to me that we had this sort of major event, the evacuation of Afghanistan, and so many Americans for so many decades had served in Afghanistan, had family members served in Afghanistan, had already helped Afghans who had come to the United States under the special immigrant visa program or otherwise, that there was this, almost all Americans were like, yes, of course we want to help these people. How can we do it? And the traditional refugee program didn't offer them a way. So this opens it up again in a way that I think we probably haven't seen in a lot of decades, that it really does link sort of the American public to this thing that had been kind of abstract. Oh, the government is bringing in people back to that personal level.
That is exactly what is happening, and you've hit the nail on the head. And I think it's what we see it. It's really exciting, and I keep hearkening back to a part of the reason I got so excited about the work of Welcome and this opportunity was many years ago when there were families arriving at the border under the Obama administration, and it was really sort of unclear what to do. There was this sort of almost panic around it. I remember talking to several friends who said, well, why can't I just say that I'll help? And my family did that for a Vietnamese family back in the late 60s and early 70s. How come I can't do that now?
There was a remembrance of, didn't we used to be able to help?
We used to do this. But it really was like, it was for the best of intentions that the resettlement agencies were set up. And again, they do amazing work and they are so important. But somewhere along the line, the system got closed to the capacity that we have from the American public. And it was this great, in many ways, it was sort of this great reawakening of that in response to Afghans. And I just can't reinforce how we've seen that same sense roll over to Ukrainians. And now really, and I think, there was skepticism that it would apply to Venezuelans, and it is applying. People are eager to help. And I think one of the things that I find very inspirational is the fact that America is a country of diasporas. We are a nation of people who came from other places. And that is what is tapping into so much of the desire to raise your hand. It's not so much, for some people it's thinking about how people helped their immediate relatives. But it's more like, I feel an affinity to X country because there is a family lore about that. And I want to help. This taps into something I feel more personally. Or we have, returned Peace Corps volunteers have become a really important part of our sponsor community. They have lived in countries that now need a helping hand, and they feel called to do that. So I think it's the very diversity of our country that makes community sponsorship, private sponsorship, really, I think, a viable path to expand existing pathways. And I think that's an important piece here. We want to make clear that the work that we're doing is adding capacity. This is not as an alternative to what is happening through refugee resettlement. That is hugely important, and we need to have more people be able to go through those pipelines, and tapping into the American capacity of welcoming is a really important way of doing that. And then I think also with Uniting for Ukraine and the process for Venezuela, what we've seen is a real innovation. The federal government trying new things and not always getting it right, but nothing's ever perfect the first time round. And I think they deserve a tremendous amount of credit for being willing to think creatively and try something that has resulted in the very swift movement of people in a very orderly way into communities all over the country, so that you don't have particular places bearing the brunt of receiving significant numbers all at once.
Yeah. So this is our Thanksgiving episode, and we like to talk about the idea that Thanksgiving is not just an opportunity for Americans to give thanks, but it also has a tradition of welcome, at least in the mythology of the holiday. And as we think about ways communities can be welcoming to newcomers, immigrants, and refugees, how do you personally think about Thanksgiving in relation to your work?
Thanks for the people and communities that bring meaning in our lives, from the very small acts, I think, of kindness that we bring to one another, bringing the pie for dinner, seeing everyone together, celebrating the togetherness. And for newcomers, these communities have often recently been uprooted. They've been forced to separate from their family and friends, those people that we are holding very dear at that day. And for newcomers, as they navigate the challenges that come with displacement, the need to feel welcomed is, I think, even more important. So for us at Welcome.us, Thanksgiving is really about drawing newcomers into our own circles and communities, and building new, meaningful connections as those newcomers integrate into their own lives in safety. And it's enriching our lives and reminding us just how powerful human connection can be.
Yeah. So for the last few Thanksgiving episodes, we've had immigrants either that work at BPC or that we know talk about their personal Thanksgiving stories and how this American holiday came to be integrated into their immigrant story. Have you had or heard from any of your Welcome US colleagues Thanksgiving stories of welcoming the newcomers?
That's funny. Yeah. Well, so for most of the newcomers that we've been helping, this will be their first Thanksgiving.
Oh,
so
great.
We are really excited to hear from them how it goes. But certainly from folks on just like you all on our staff, we have many people who are themselves older newcomers who came not that recently, and there are certainly wonderful stories about the transition from traditional, cooking the traditional homeland food to now fully embracing, maybe more than Americans do, the turkey and the mashed potatoes, and I think we've also talked within our own team about how many of us have really blended Thanksgiving traditions. So. That bring in pieces of immigrant heritage. And one example is, and this isn't even about food, but my family, my last name is McMurray, but for Thanksgiving every year we use these cloth napkins that my great-great-grandmother, who decided she did not want to be Mick because that was Irish, she wanted to be a Mac because that was Scottish. So she had all of our we have an emblem, a family emblem that's not real. We have these cloth napkins that have MAC embroidered on them. And it's a reminder of our own sort of heritage and coming from separate places, and how we sometimes felt good about that and sometimes didn't. And the things that you do to try to fit in, and the stories that you tell to try to fit in. And I think, so much of what we're doing is to try to help people feel like they don't have to try in that way, that they are welcome as they come, and that we want to celebrate that difference and enrich our own lives through that partnership with them.
Anya, thank you so much for joining us on this Thanksgiving episode. If people want to engage more, where should they go to find more about all of this?
Welcome.us is the place to go. And if you're interested in sponsorship, please take a look at our sponsorship opportunities there. It will change your life and you won't regret it.
Well, thanks so much again, and happy Thanksgiving to you and your family.
You too. Thanks so much, Theresa.
We now welcome our spring intern, Lucija Bebek, who will share with us her own immigrant Thanksgiving story. Welcome, Lucija.
Thanks for having me.
So first, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you've worked on here at BPC.
Sure. My name's Lucija Bebek. I'm currently a junior at Loyola University of Chicago, majoring in political science, and I am in DC through a program that my school runs called LUC in DC. And I'm currently at the BPC working as an intern on the immigration team, and it's been really great just learning about our immigration system and finding out things that I never knew about before and just how much goes into the work that they do here.
Great. Well, why don't you tell me what Thanksgiving means to you?
Thanksgiving is a really important holiday in my household, specifically because I moved to the United States when I was 6 years old with my family. And for a long time, we did not celebrate Thanksgiving because we just didn't find it to be something important to us. We had no emotional or personal connection to it. And then when I was, I think, 13 or 12, somewhere around there, I had a really good friend of mine who is American invite me and my family over for Thanksgiving. And after that point, we've just celebrated it every year. And it's really an opportunity for my immediate family to get together and just kind of reflect on the year and, you know, feel like it's just a really warm fall holiday that we love to celebrate.
So why did you initially not celebrate it, and how did your friend inviting you for Thanksgiving, how did that sort of integrate the holiday into your family tradition?
I think that assimilating was actually really hard for my family in the beginning, and I don't think that Thanksgiving was something that my parents considered to be most important to us as, you know, immigrants in a new country. It was more important for us to, you know, do well in school and learn English and kind of learn how to live a life in a completely different culture. So Thanksgiving was just kind of swept under the rug. And not only that, it's my parents didn't understand the background of Thanksgiving. I guess as a child, I didn't come home and explain to them, you know, why we're doing, you know, hand turkeys and why this is such a big holiday. I didn't really put an emphasis on it because I didn't understand it myself. Because usually, like, you learn about holidays because your parents taught you them, not because you learned them at school. So I didn't bring that home. But as I got older and I became really good friends with that girl, her name's Ashley, she kind of showed me just how important that is to her family and to families in America. And then I started drawing more attention to it and then talking about it at home. And her family was so loving and just decided to introduce us to that. And it felt really nice to be surrounded by family, being in a country where you're not with your family. So it meant something that, like, we could sit down and sit together as a family when often, like, in the hustle and bustle of a new life, you forget about family because you're not always with them, if you get what I mean.
So are there ways that you've adapted your culture into your celebration of Thanksgiving?
For sure. My mom, she always makes a turkey, which is that's very Thanksgiving, but we don't really do the sweet potatoes, and there's dishes that we just don't like because it's not in our palate. It's not what we're used to eating. So my mom often makes like stuffed peppers, and she makes like really traditional Croatian dishes. So it's like kind of integrated. So we don't have like the cranberry sauce, and I don't have the mac and cheese because my mother doesn't consider mac and cheese to be like a side dish. I don't know why. She's always like, that's not something to have at the dinner table. That's like a quick meal. But yeah, definitely the food is super mixed. It's kind of unique to us.
And do you feel that Thanksgiving is sort of a particularly American holiday, and do you feel like it's played a part in your family's journey to integration in the U.S.?
I think that it is a uniquely American holiday, mainly because in the immigrant community that I'm a part of, it is kind of one thing that immigrants pride themselves most on, like living in America. When they talk about, they're like, oh yeah, we celebrate Thanksgiving. That's an American holiday. And it's like, it's not, it doesn't have like the attitude that Labor Day has or the 4th of July. There's something superior about Thanksgiving, and then it's something to be so proud of. Like, that's like the American holiday where they came and they had, on the Mayflower, and like it's the whole story about just like the creation of the day. And I think that they hold that to be really unique to America and Americans in general. But it has been super integral to our integration in American society and culture, just participating in Thanksgiving shopping and, truly understanding like what you're getting ready for and kind of having that Thanksgiving spirit, and then understanding that after Thanksgiving, then we're in the Christmas season. And then it's a whole thing that's become really important to us as an immigrant family. And I think that it is for a lot of immigrant families that do adapt it into their life.
And one of the things that we talked about was the different meaning that Thanksgiving has to immigrant families. You pointed out that it's sort of a different holiday because you can't gather your full extended family because most of them are not in the U.S. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the different meaning of Thanksgiving, since it is mostly an immediate family celebration for you?
Sure. I guess in the beginning, that was something that kind of made me sad, because you hear about families getting together all around the United States and people are flying out and Thanksgiving is busy and everyone's trying to gather and decide which home they're going to spend it in. It's like a conversation of how are you going to gather, who's going to make what, who's going to bring this. But the reality is in my family that we are a family of 4 who doesn't have anyone near. Everyone that we have like close to our hearts is 4,000 miles away. So this holiday is really kind of a time for the 4 of us to reflect. And I guess over the years, it has become special because it truly reminds us why we stay in America. And it's important because we have created our own meaning to it. Like just us sitting down and saying this is a holiday for us 4, gathering our family and just, really being thankful for what we have here today. And I think that's true for a lot of immigrant families who have come here recently and don't have a big family to invite. But it's also important because immigrant families are kind of used to celebrating Thanksgiving with friends. There is many people who create like a family Thanksgiving dinner, but it's people that you've met. You come from the same country, you come from the same town, you created a different family in a different country. And just because they're not blood related, that doesn't really take away from the fact that like you have them over on a family oriented holiday. So,
well, thank you so much for sharing what Thanksgiving means to you and your family. And we have been very lucky to have you this semester.
I've been very, very happy here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And that's it for our show this week. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow Theresa Brown at BPC_T Brown, and I'm on Twitter at Hannah E. Tai. I'm Hannah Tyler. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Hannah Tyler and Theresa Cardinal Brown. The executive producer of BPC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. See you next time on This Week in Immigration.